As a libertarian, it might shock you when I say drugs are bad. I myself don't do any drugs. But obviously, your body, your choice and all that. What right do I have to tell you to lay off the devil's cabbage? But while there is a lot to be said for the pretty colours, mellow vibes, stirred eyes, empty fridges and awkward conversations about how you were baked and you forgot to let the dog in last night, never mind, it's winter, he's dead now, there is an entire class of drugs that, if abused, can lead to some pretty devastating consequences. Which makes them perfect for warfare. While everyone likes to focus on the fighter planes and tanks, a lot of research that took place during World War II involved stimulants. And since this was one of the most horrific wars in human history, desperate times called for desperate measures. And the boffins turned to something a little bit more potent in their quest to create the perfect super soldier. Today's Mad Lad is the logical conclusion of that research. After receiving an edge that would make him a legend, he answered the age-old burning question. What happens when you take an absolute unit, put him into one of the deadliest situations imaginable, and then fill him to the brim with meth? You get Corporal Aimo Koivunen. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, we have a new sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a new app and website that lets you see how breaking news is covered across the political spectrum in one place. With just a swipe or a click, you can quickly compare articles from thousands of publications around the world and see the ownership and factuality of those sources. A feature that I find particularly interesting is the blind spot feed, which allows you to see news that you might have missed by showing you articles that have little coverage on either the left or the right. Ground News is a great way to save time and stay fully informed on issues around the world by giving you all the news you could want in one place, and also have some awareness of where, who and how trustworthy the sources are that you get the information from. The way it compares both right, centre and left-wing articles is the most neutral way to deal with the chaos that is today's news media. So if you want to stay fully informed on breaking news as it's happening around the world and you want to know where your news is coming from, then click the link in the description or go to ground.news/Count Dankula. Subscribe before December the 23rd and get 35% off of unlimited access. New sponsor. Show them some love and support my channel. Click the link. Performance enhancers are nothing new in military contexts, because alcohol and caffeine have long been staples of supply packs for their effect on soldiers' morale and energy levels. But what might surprise you is that narcotics were also issued fairly liberally in the early 20th century. After all, this was a time when your kids' fizzy drinks contained literal cocaine, and the easiest solution to your wife being depressed was for her to just do heroin about it, which she could get over the counter in any pharmacy. I would like to take this time to thank Big Pharma. Without them, Trainspotting would never have happened. While both sides made very liberal use of amphetamines during the war, it was the Germans that made the most prolific use of them, and a load of other weird and wonderful concoctions. Now, Nazi medicine is an entire rabbit hole in and of itself, and Theodore Morell deserves an entire video for blessing us with that amazing footage of Hitler tweaking out of his fucking gourd at the Olympics. But if we get into Hitler's medicine cabinet, we'll be here all day, so let's just focus on the frontline prescriptions. The Nazis experimented with a whole host of substances such as cocaine, meth, and whatever the fuck else the Führer was shooting up that day to help mitigate the physical and mental toll of warfare on their soldiers. One such result was D-IX, which was a combination of meth, cocaine, and oxycodone. But the most notable product was Pervitin, which was patented in 1937 by a German pharmaceutical company named Temmler. Since it was created as an over-the-counter energy supplement and cure for depression, Pervitin was initially tested on the second most tired and depressed demographic in the world: college students. And it was so successful that a German doctor had the bright idea of giving it to the most tired and depressed demographic: soldiers, where it became an instant hit. The energy that a single Pervitin pill provided was enough to keep Jerry marching all through the night, with no need for sleep. Or even food, for that matter, because Pervitin was very good at suppressing appetites. The energy boost that it provided was so effective that it promised practically unlimited power at an even lower price than a cup of coffee. Pervitin was so successful that in April of 1940, the Germans issued a stimulant decree, and the front lines became inner cities as 35 million pills flooded the soldiers' ration packs, where they were essentially used like sensu beans. If a soldier was tired from battle, all he had to do was take 1 or 2 pills for a second wind. It was almost perfect, except for the fact that Pervitin was meth. Like, literally. Like, Pervitin was just literally raw meth. Also, if you are anything like me and you like to spend some evenings unwinding by watching Steve MRE's ration unboxing videos while absolutely not smoking the devil's cabbage, you will know that Pervitin made the ration collecting hobby a little bit dodgy. Because if you buy an old World War II ration, you need to be careful because there might be some literal meth inside it. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but buying, selling, and possessing meth is a crime. So ration collectors need to be a little bit careful. So the soldiers were all on meth. Now, we're going to unpack why that was a little bit of a problem later on, but I don't think I need to spell out why getting an entire army hooked on meth might have not been the brightest idea. However, it undeniably worked wonders, with one commander's report reading, "Everyone was fresh and cheerful, excellent discipline, slight euphoria and increased thirst for action, mental encouragement, very stimulated, no accidents, long-lasting effect." This is like a German Nazis report, but it sounds like one of those drug adverts you get in America. Have you seen American drug adverts? Jesus fucking Christ. But anyway, as you are about to see, Pervitin worked almost a little bit too well. Enter our boy, Imo Koivunen, who was fighting the good fight against the Soviets in the continuation war. We've discussed the Finnish war effort enough times by now that I'm sure you get the gist. Guerrilla warfare, German backing, skis, the most furious snowmen you've ever seen, etc, etc. Watch the Laurie Torney video if you need a refresher. On the 18th of March 1944, Imo was on his third day of a ski patrol deep behind enemy lines, just south of Murmansk, when he and his unit were ambushed by the Soviets. What happened next was a microcosm in the war as a whole. After putting up one hell of a firefight, the Finns were ultimately surrounded, and unfortunately they were forced to give up and retreat, with Imo only just managing to lead an escape. Now, this was day 3 of a long patrol, so the unit were already running on fumes. But skiing like his life depended on it for hours really took a toll on Imo, because he had the added task, because he was in front, of cutting a path through the knee-deep snow for the rest of his unit. Soon enough, fatigue set in, and Imo found himself beginning to fall behind, which he couldn't afford because the Soviets were still hot on the Finns' heels. Imo began to panic because he desperately needed an energy boost, and as luck would have it, he was in charge of his unit's Pervitin supply, which was one of the perks of the Finnish alliance with Germany. He'd actually been put in charge of carrying the supply because he hated the idea of taking these pills. So they were all given to him since he could be trusted not to dip into the supply for a little bit of a buzz. However, despite hating the idea of taking these pills, the need was dire. So he reluctantly reached into his pocket and took the bottle out. But try as he might, he just couldn't get a pill out. The darkness, his thick mittens, and the fact that he couldn't stop skiing meant that Imo didn't have the dexterity required to fish just a single pill out of the bottle. In a fit of desperation, Imo did something that had never been tried in the heat of battle before. He just tipped the bottle into his hand and swallowed whatever landed there. Naturally, this meant that Imo would OD a little bit. But under the circumstances, taking 1 or 2 extra pills isn't too bad, is it? Well, Imo had gotten a little bit carried away. Because it was dark, he couldn't see exactly how much meth he had emptied into his hand. It turned out it was all of it. It was the entire fucking bottle. And he took them. He just shoved all of the meth into his mouth. He took all of the meth. He consumed an entire unit's worth of meth in 1 dose. He had enough meth inside him to turn 30 men into Trevor Phillips. And he took all of it. He took all the meth. To say that Imo overdosed is a little bit like saying that Amy Winehouse enjoyed a glass of wine before bed. The burst of energy that this unholy amount of meth had given Imo basically turned him into a Super Saiyan and gave him the strength he needed to lead his men at a much faster pace than ever. Imo was moving so quickly that the Soviets just could not keep up with his unit, and soon they lost them. But there was just one other little teeny tiny problem. Imo was going so fast that his own unit couldn't keep up with him. They just had to sit there and watch. They were probably shouting on him and everything. Imo, where the fuck are you going? As this little dot going at 30 miles an hour through the snow, full of fucking meth, just vanished over the horizon. Soon, Imo found that his vision was starting to blur, and because he took enough meth to kill a fucking horse, he eventually went delirious and blacked out. Now, this is normally where I would tell you that Imo's heart gave out, but the path that he cut through the snow allowed his comrades to ski to safety, living to fight another day thanks to Imo's heroic sacrifice, because Imo really should have died right then and there. But despite all of the odds, Imo woke up the next day. Alive. He had survived. He was the highest any human being had ever been in the history of mankind, but he was alive. But there was just one other little tiny problem. His comrades were nowhere to be found. And Imo was also nowhere to be found, because it turned out that even though he had blacked out, it was just his brain that had stopped. His body had not. And he had just kept skiing while he was blacked out. So he literally wasn't out of the woods just yet because he was completely alone in the middle of a forest 62 miles away from where he first started. And he had absolutely no fucking idea where he was because he got there during a meth blackout that he couldn't remember. And, as if that wasn't bad enough, he was stuck out there with nothing but his empty rifle, some water, and the clothes on his back. Imo's luck was so bad that he managed to wake up to a nightmare. He was stuck in the middle of a frigid wasteland with temperatures of minus 20 degrees centigrade with no supplies and absolutely no chance of backup. And, as if that wasn't enough, he was still being pursued by the Soviets. The situation seemed hopeless. IMO was standing alone against not just the Soviets, but also the elements themselves, which was too much for any one man to handle. Anyone else in IMO's situation would have given up and surrendered themselves to fate. However, IMO was unlike anyone else. Fate had bestowed upon him a raw power that no man was ever meant to wield. There was nothing more than divine providence keeping IMO alive as he teetered on the edge of the analog version of cyberpsychosis, so he decided to ride that edge all the way home. Sure, he probably wasn't going to make it. Any second he could succumb to meth-induced delirium, or his heart could just fucking explode from the strain, but even just trying would still be better than just waiting to die at the hands of the Soviets. Besides, what's the point of having the strength of 30 men coursing through your veins if you're not going to make the most of it? So, IMO got on his skis and set off. Now, it is a well-known fact that history is written by the victors. After all, everyone wants to paint themselves as the righteous heroes triumphing over those barbaric, treacherous heathens, or as they like to call themselves, the French. You know how it goes. The losers' war crimes are thoroughly denounced as the monstrous acts they are, while the victors' war crimes are swept under the rug and treated as mere isolated gamer moments. Which means that historians aren't exactly sure of what really happened. Well, we have a similar thing here, but for a slightly different reason. Our source for this entire video is IMO himself. And IMO himself isn't really sure of what happened because he was on so much fucking meth. His memory of what happened next is patchy at best. But there is one thing that he knew for certain. He was absolutely off his tits. IMO didn't have to travel far before he found some familiar faces. How fortunate. His journey had only just started and he'd already spotted a camp in the distance. He'd found his friends. He was saved. Salvation had come. IMO didn't even hesitate as he excitedly skied right into the middle of the camp, and it turned out to be the camp of the very Soviets that were after him. It was... He skated right into the middle of the camp of the very same Soviets that were hunting him down. And I think the reason that the Soviets didn't just shoot him instantly is because he approached the camp with such confidence and glee that they must have just assumed he was one of theirs. Fortunately, even though he was as high as a fucking kite, IMO was lucid enough to look around and go, I believe I might have fucked up a little here. So he very quickly skied away, but that didn't stop the Soviets from going, what the fuck, and chasing after him through the snow. I mean, after all, he did just ski right into the middle of their fucking camp. After spending an entire day shaking off the Soviets, IMO found a cabin in the woods, which was a perfect rest stop. He went inside, lit a fire, and went to sleep. And while we all appreciate a nice cosy snooze by the fire, IMO woke up in the middle of the night because he found himself a little bit too warm. The entire cabin was on fire. So, what did IMO do? Did he try to save his shelter by putting the fire out? Did he cut his losses and leave? Nope, he just went, this is fine. And he laid down on the ground just outside the burning cabin and went back to sleep. After all, what is warmer than a burning house? It was minus 20 out there. You can't let a good fire go to waste. I mean, he might not have been able to use the cabin anymore, but it could still keep him warm. Luckily, it wasn't too long after IMO set off when he saw another light from another cabin in the distance. So he followed it, until he eventually noticed that the light wasn't getting any closer. But for once, it wasn't a hallucination, of which IMO had many during his journey, that was leading him astray. He had just been following the North Star. Upon realising his mistake, I can't really say that IMO went back on course because he never really had a course in the first place, but nevertheless, he did eventually come across a deserted German camp that would have been perfect to rest in if it hadn't been booby-trapped. Imo stepped on a mine and shredded his right leg. Then he opened a cabin door because he could really do with some shelter to have a little lie down, but the door was also booby-trapped, and he got blown up again, with the explosion throwing him 30 feet into a ditch. But on the bright side, it must have been a very comfy ditch, because Imo just decided to lie in it exactly where he landed for a week. Yet again, Imo nearly died and went, "This is fine," and went for a sleep. Because meth. While the meth wasn't wearing off anytime soon, Imo did find himself starting to get a little bit peckish. He mainly survived on nothing but pine buds and melted snow, but he could feel the meth costing him his gains, so he got a little bit of protein by catching a Siberian jay and eating it raw. I dread to think what kind of monstrosity that poor bird saw in his final moments, but that's not funny. Now, a diet like that sounds really bad, because it is, but Imo wouldn't have felt the hunger as much as you would expect, because the meth was suppressing his appetite. So, the meth was keeping him alive in more ways than one, because he was mostly unfazed by the near total lack of sustenance available in this frigid wasteland. However, the high wouldn't last forever, and Imo knew that he couldn't stay in this ditch for much longer, especially after he realised that the Germans that provided his accommodation had abandoned the place and they weren't coming back. So he just strapped what was left of his feet to his skis and carried on with his journey. Now, you would think that after being blown up and having to keep skiing, Imo's luck couldn't get any worse. And you would be wrong. Imo was then attacked by a wolverine, but a wolverine wasn't a landmine, so Imo refused to take this lying down, and he put up a valiant fight until he snapped out of his hallucination and realised that he was just beating up a tree. I'm sorry. He'd hallucinated the whole thing, and he was just fighting with a tree. Sorry. Where was I? Well, after showing the tree who was boss, Imo continued on his way until eventually the inevitable finally happened. Imo ran out of steam and just collapsed in the snow, with only just enough energy to babble deliriously non-stop as he hallucinated. Imo had been given the strength of the gods, and he had put it to spectacular use for 2 glorious weeks now. So now it was time for his reward. As he laid there, babbling with his brain probably melting, Imo was picked up and taken to his final destination, where he would bask in the glory of his quest and feast alongside some of history's greatest warriors. However, it wouldn't be a Valkyrie taking him there, but Finnish soldiers. Somehow, despite getting to the point where not even the meth could save him, Imo survived long enough to be picked up by Finnish soldiers who could hear him babbling somewhere out in the snow. And they took one look at the absolute state of him and they immediately rushed him to the hospital. But we're not done yet, because fucking of course we aren't. That would be too fucking easy. On the way to the hospital, one of the soldiers stepped on a landmine. Finnish soldiers seem to have a real problem with landmines. But Imo's rescuers then had to rush that guy to hospital and just leave Imo lying there for a few days and wait for them to come back to him. And somehow, the lucky bastard managed to survive that as well. As promised, the Finnish soldiers returned to Imo, and his 2-week-long, 250-mile journey came to an end when he finally arrived at the Finnish hospital via the scenic route, shall we call it. As he came down from the most legendary high of all time, Imo seriously needed emergency treatment, during which the full extent of just how fucked up he was became apparent. His right foot was described as a mixture of grated flesh and splinters, which was probably the least concerning thing on his medical chart. As a result of how little Imo ate during his adventure, he weighed only 94 pounds, which is just shy of 43 kilograms in real measurements. Imo had lost so much weight that he was now more meth than man, though he was still heavier than your average communist. And 2 weeks after that fateful dose, the Pervitin was still affecting Imo. His heart rate was measured at 200 beats per minute. For perspective, an average resting heart rate is between 60 to 100 beats per minute. I mean, look at this man's eyes. Look at this man's eyes. Those are eyes that have seen God. Despite his diabolical condition, Imo managed to make a full recovery from the literal trip of a lifetime, and perhaps unsurprisingly, he is the only known soldier to survive a meth overdose behind enemy lines. That's a pretty niche achievement. I've got a feeling that that's a very, very empty leaderboard. But while he managed to make it out of the other end relatively unscathed, many of his comrades were not so lucky. It didn't take long after the stimulant decree for the mass reports of deaths from heart failure, suicide, and negligence due to mental fatigue to start coming in as a direct result of Pervitin. It's funny how history repeats itself, isn't it? But by the time the German government realised that it had fucked up and outlawed Pervitin, it was too late. Everyone, even civilians, were now taking it. And no one was going to stop. What followed was a massive addiction problem because pretty much everyone was taking too much Pervitin. After all, when you tell someone who is already exhausted 24/7 to take 1 to 2 pills only as needed, well, they're going to pop them like fucking Smarties. And if returning to civilian life addicted to their military rations wasn't bad enough, the side effects as a result of even normal doses were really fucked. They included chronic nausea, seizures, irregular heartbeat, high blood pressure, psychosis, paranoia, and bleeding in the brain. But despite having taken enough meth to buy Walter Jr. breakfast for the rest of his life, by some miracle, Imo had no long or even short-term effects at all. I believe the medical term is he was built different. In fact, Imo managed to survive the rest of the war, and he lived until 1989 when he passed away at the ripe old age of 71. According to his son, Imo didn't talk about his adventure, likely due to the trauma that he went through, but I also have a feeling, and this is just my opinion, that the whole experience was just such a blur for Imo, who did hallucinate the entire time, that he might not have trusted what he did manage to remember, and therefore didn't have very much to say. Nevertheless, the world needed to hear Imo's story, and in 1978 he wrote a memoir for a Finnish magazine that was holding a war story contest. And, much like Helge Meyer's autobiography, this memoir would have been really helpful for the writing of this video had it been written in a real language. But what happened next is arguably the most shocking part of this entire story. In the war story contest, Imo came second. He came second. Imo told the world that he had gotten so unimaginably high that he carved a 250-mile path across the forest, skied straight through the camp of the very men that were hunting him, blew himself up twice, went toe-to-toe with Ted Kaczynski's stand, and somehow managed to not freeze to death when his rescuers abandoned him for a few days. All while tripping absolute fucking balls the entire time, and he came fucking second. I know that we like our facts here on Mad Lads, because as much as we enjoy crazy antics, they're always a lot more fun when they're real. There are many stories that I would absolutely love to cover, but I can't because of unreliable narrators that make them hard to tell objectively. And the last thing that I want to do is not do them justice by giving you an inaccurate account. But I thought I would go for this one because while even Jeffrey Lebowski had a less crazy drug trip than Imo, the broad strokes of the story are pretty clear. And also, even if some of the stuff isn't remembered correctly and it was a hallucination, it's still madly entertaining. I also just really liked Imo's story because in a way it really invokes the indomitable human spirit, doesn't it? Imo was in one of the worst situations imaginable and he managed to use what he had to his advantage. He turned the odds in his favour and he made it home in almost one piece, minus a few dozen pounds and a foot. It just goes to show you that you can do anything as long as you have enough willpower, courage, resilience, and meth. Lots and lots of meth. If you want to achieve your dreams, you should do a shit ton of meth. For legal reasons, that's a joke.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody subscribe.